Okay, it looks like we still got a few people trickling in, but I think we could get started. We've got 50 joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for making the time in your busy work schedules for this project. We really appreciate your input. All right. So again, same team as you've met on previous meetings. Myself, I'm Adele Phillips. I'm the Certified Floodplain Manager with the Department of Natural Resources. Michelle York's also on the call, helping us make this thing run. We've got Elijah Kaufman. He's another NFIP specialist that does a lot of community outreach with me. And then we've got Katie Ringland, also from Department of Natural Resources. She's our state NFIP coordinator. And then, of course, we've got our team from HDR that is also enabling us to get this plan created. And Julie Molichek's on the call, helping again with the behind-the-scenes interactivity. And then John Engel is going to be presenting today's presentation. We've got a broad range of items to cover. So with that, I guess it's 10:03. Let's get started.
All right. Well, thank you, Adele. Wanted to touch on the agenda for today. One of the things we want to do right up front is at our December meeting and afterwards, we had a survey of some questions, primarily focused around state capabilities and suggestions. And so we'll run through that. We'll give an update on the flood risk assessment. We'll talk about mitigation strategies and the project pages we've developed and that will be available for your review and comment. Adele's going to lead a discussion on the repetitive losses. And then we'll do ongoing effort update and what's upcoming, and then wrap it up with next steps. So with that, kind of the goals of today's meeting, what we're looking for from you is we'd love to hear the comments and discussions on the survey results we're going to walk through and kind of the takeaways that we got from the survey. We'd like some input on the risk assessment approach. And then today and going forward, comments on the mitigation strategies featured in the project pages we've developed is something we're interested in. And then as part of the repetitive losses discussion, we do have some data requests that Adele will touch on. So that's kind of the main focus that we would like to accomplish with your participation today. I'll go right into the review of December survey results. And Julie, I'd ask, when I'm presenting, I don't have a chat box or anything. So if someone pipes in or please interrupt me and let me know. So we had the survey, and I think there was 8 or 10 questions, and our responses were pretty good. I think we had 20 to 30 responses. And what I thought I would do is kind of walk through each of the questions, kind of the summary, and then the takeaway that the project team had. So the first question was, should Nebraska consider adopting more stringent standards? And, you know, 3/4 of the respondents felt that the state standards are fine as is, or were really unsure if any more stringent standards needed to be adopted. The comments range from, there really needs better education and better enforcement on current standards, and the major concerns with adopting more stringent standards were kind of twofold. One of them was, there's uncertainty and confusion in the public with the current standards, and making them more stringent would only cause more confusion and be counterproductive. And then the second part was really kind of on the economic side, that there's certainly an economic impact to more stringent standards, and that needs to be considered as well. The takeaway that we got from that was really that the focus on dissemination of education and information for floodplain managers to better manage their floodplains is more productive than pursuing more stringent standards. Second question was opportunities for improvements in the regulation or administration regarding floodplains. A lot of the responses focused on improvement in building or construction requirements and ordinances. That there was some opportunity for improvement in really the administration, both state and locally. Some zoning improvements. The county participation in the NFIP was mentioned by a respondent. And really, there were more opportunities for public programs and education. The takeaway from those were really the development or inclusion of planning and zoning ordinances. And the DNR does have sample ordinances on their website, and they do review all ordinances before adoption. So a lot of that's occurring. Again, it's kind of a making the local floodplain administrators more aware of some of the resources. And then training and support, particularly for small communities. And there's an opportunity for enhancement of the DNR outreach. Currently they have monthly virtual trainings and 2 in-person workshops per year. So maybe you'll see when we get to maybe there's some initiatives later on that discuss specifically about the outreach and training opportunities. The third question was what additional technical support would benefit flood hazard mitigation? And it was either enhancement of existing services or new services needed. There was a lot, of discussion about community participated education and access to information, and in particular, better mapping. And I think Katie in December went through a lot of the mapping activities, and I'll review those here. And the whole letter of map amendment, letter of map revision, documents and surveys, some of the modeling output, more accessible site for administrators. There was a couple of them are in assistance preparing applications for mitigation grants, as well as state fund for cost sharing, and we'll touch on both of those as well. And then they talk about new state positions, and that's really a staff augmentation, again, to help out in support of the grant applications on those benefit cost analyses that are required. Again, I wanted to review some of the stuff that Katie said, because a lot of the information that was requested, they are providing. This is from Katie's presentation in December, and touches on what the department's technical assistance capabilities currently are. They do provide base flood elevation to local, state, and federal agencies. They assist in floodplain management administration and enforcement activities. They're available to do that. They assist communities in both joining the NFIP and the community rating system. They do review all ordinances before adoption. Touching a little bit on their educational workshops and training, they do have the monthly virtual trainings that are every third Thursday. They have the in-person workshops twice a year. As far as their opportunities in federal funding through FEMA, they do have the State Support Services Element Program, which is part of the community assistance. And they have the CTP Risk Mapping, Assessment, and Planning Program that they are actively engaging to bring federal dollars in to support their efforts. And this is just some of the topics that were part of the monthly virtual trainings, everything from basic floodplain management to ordinances to mitigation to some of the tools like the interactive mapping. They had over 500 in attendance throughout last year at those types of trainings. The target audiences, and I'll touch on this because there were some comments later about some of the audiences. The kind of a broad spectrum from the planning and zoning folks to the insurance to the legal to the county officials, as well as the professional surveyors and the other technical groups. So they do reach a fairly broad group of folks that play in the floodplain, so to speak. The takeaway that we got from this is really to raise the awareness of available programs and technical and financial support that the department's engaged in. And part of that may be to look at potential staffing needs for a broader outreach and support, as well as focused on assisting in the grant application process for many of the smaller communities that lack the technical ability as well as quite frankly the time that it takes on those efforts. Another area we inquired about is our alternative or improved ways to display or provide flood hazard information. The first was again kind of touching on that it really needs to be an improved outreach from the state on the tools that are available. There was a comment on text messaging for opting in. And I think some of that's available from an emergency management. I'm not sure. There's no current program for communicating, base flood information like the website has. Separate discussion of commercial and residential flood insurance costs and benefits and repetitive losses. And so that's kind of gets into the insurance side a little bit. And then in-person training or the comments. And a quick review of what the department does have is, they've got the floodplain interactive map. It provides the flood awareness areas. It provides depth grids, so you get an idea of the severity of flooding, as well as all of the regulatory floodplain information is housed at their flood risk website. Their interactive mapping. And then Katie touched on some additional work that they're currently doing that's going to focus on real-time flood forecasting. And it's got some grant. They're looking at providing pre-delineated inundation boundaries for every half-foot stage for 48 gauges impacting 54 communities that you can look at a gauge and what the projected gauge height is or flood stage during a particular event and get a feel for what the inundation limits are and what the potential flood risks may be in real time. And that'll also be an online interactive map that'll be available. So the takeaways were really most of the technical and the requests for information is available, and it's more again a case of raising the awareness of the available technical support and information that's out there. Had a question just in general about how future mapping projects should be prioritized. And we got a lot of different, as you might expect, a lot of different ways to do this. The most common had kind of the greatest risk or impact or highest probability of flooding were kind of identified. And other common responses were the largest floodplains or the largest impact or areas with substantial development that were impacted. Another common response was just on the age, in some of these areas, 20 to 30-year-old mapping, that the oldest should be prioritized. And then one response was a priority based on the development in rural floodplain areas. And so in looking at, what their charge is by statute, that, most of the factors that were mentioned in the survey are considered in their current approach. In December, we talked about what their prioritization requirements and by statute, what they must consider. and you can see the list there, and that kind of all are all items that were identified. So there was really no change in the prioritization, or it just kind of supports what they've been doing, and no new factors necessarily. Another question, are there training topics or educational issues that would support better flood hazard mitigation? And we received a lot of input. There was a lot of discussion, several comments that talked about just general trainings or education or materials for the general public, to help them understand why behind the floodplain management ordinances and activities, and the importance of flood insurance. There's some comments about training and support that are geared towards, the small cities and villages that maybe don't have the density of development and maybe have a more varied floodplain use within their community. There was discussion about identifying communities of repetitive losses and maybe making those into case studies for training and education opportunities throughout the state. There's considering economic and again the economic impact to existing and future development potential on flood hazard mitigation. Some of the comments were on technical, like how to request a LOMAR. And there was also a comment in general about training should be more centralized so more administrators can attend. And that's something that the department will be considering as well. We'll also touch on that when we talk about our next steps in our public hearings. We'd like some input. And so the takeaway is really considered, when we reviewed what the department's current activities are, they're all kind of focused around technical groups, whether it's legal or zoning or planning or engineering or survey, and then maybe a broader based targeted and general public education may be warranted or may be beneficial. And then looking at the program for training overall, there was a lot of different topics, the format, person, virtual, as well as maybe some of the targeted audiences and communities that maybe the more holistic training program may benefit. One of the questions was, should Nebraska consider a dedicated funding stream for supporting flood mitigation projects or other activities to mitigate flood hazard? The majority of respondents were in favor of a dedicated funding stream. And there were several suggestions that were really interesting, something like a very low interest loan, or a cost share on buyouts that would be beneficial, particularly in low income communities. Funding for flood mitigation projects that really provide those local administrators and floodplain managers some opportunities to address concerns in their community. Support and training, support training and CEU requirements for floodplain managers, again, more on the education side. And then some funding focused on the small communities that would help support those. Again, some of those without the larger public work budget or stormwater management budgets overall. And there was a comment that I thought was interesting that, as I think Adele had mentioned either in October or December about some of the enhanced floodplain standards. A funding stream becomes especially important if those more restrictive standards for eligibility and FEMA funding come forward. And so the takeaway is really to consider a dedicated flood hazard mitigation funding source, and the department will be considering that. And it's something that certainly would have to go through the legislature, and but it's something definitely worth considering as part of the plan activities. There was a question about the state capabilities that we haven't identified in additional, and there was kind of three major areas. One is the utility infrastructure. That's more geared towards looking at flood impacts and something a little broader than just road and bridge infrastructure, but looking at high pressure gas lines, looking at water and wastewater treatment facilities and conveyance facilities, power grid effects, all of those elements that are certainly in harm's way during a flood. There's comment on the cleaning state and county-owned ditches and creeks that carry runoff, more of a maintenance or an operation and maintenance activity that was mentioned. The communication, again, a better outreach and explanation to communities, specifically regarding any changes that may be occurring to their regulated floodplain. So the takeaway, again, the inclusion of utilities in risk assessments, and when we talk about that in a bit, that has been incorporated. And then when we look at flood hazard mitigation and funding, and the consideration of long-term operation and maintenance needs to be a factor. So kind of to summarize the results, and the takeaway from the survey, from the department's floodplain management activities, there's a real need to raise the awareness of training and technical assistance available. A need to maybe take a look at some of the format and topics and ways to reach the largest audiences, including those small communities. And then the potential outreach and education geared towards the general public to raise their awareness. From a funding standpoint, to consider a dedicated flood hazard mitigation project funding stream, which considers operation and maintenance. And then from a mapping prioritization and state floodplain standards or regulations, no changes were identified. So I went through that kind of quick. I'd be interested if anyone had any comments or questions on the results of the survey or some of the takeaways that were garnered. If not, I can move on. Okay. I wanted to provide an update on the flood risk assessment, and just as a reminder, from the statute 61-228, and that called for, I'll just tell you, compile a centralized list of critical infrastructure and state-owned facilities and identify those with the highest risk of flooding. In compiling such a list, the Department of Natural Resources shall consult and collaborate with other state and local agencies that have information that identifies vulnerable facilities. So that was kind of the charge from the legislation. Kind of a status update. We're well underway on kind of the compilation of the data. We've got the statewide parcel data sets. We've got all of the critical facilities. We've got a database of the state-owned facilities. We've pulled together ag land coverages, NWI, National Wetland Inventory. We've got some of the SOVI index information, all the roads and bridges in that critical facilities. If you recall, that includes things like emergency response, that includes schools, that includes utilities, the high pressure gas lines, the wastewater treatment, the water treatment facilities. All of those kind of elements were part of that critical facility database. We've also assembled the special flood hazard area data sets, and that includes the FEMA mapped areas as well as those areas that have been evaluated in flood hazard boundaries have been developed by the department. So we've got kind of the, in two dimensions, if you can imagine, we've kind of got the location of all of these facilities, and we've got the lines or limits of inundation that have been developed. We are working on the statewide DEM at a 1 meter resolution, and that processing is ongoing statewide. And that'll provide that third dimension to give a kind of a depth grid so we can get an evaluation of flooding depths at these critical facilities as a way to kind of quantify the risk that they have, as well as the economic impacts and at risk. And that's being developed in a GIS tool that will live on past this project, and as either the land use or the parcel data set or critical infrastructure, any of those data sets are updated, as well as the new flood hazard information. It'll be a tool that can be easily updated and the risk assessment reevaluated. The detailed effort and report on that will be appended to the state flood hazard mitigation plan. When we get to our next steps, our goal is to have a draft plan out to you in March that we will discuss at the April meeting. And for the flood hazard, for the flood risk assessment, this effort will not be completed by that time. And so for the state flood hazard mitigation plan document, our risk narrative is really building off the FEMA National Risk Index. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. But Adele, certainly jump in if I'm missing or misstating this. But so they have the National Risk Index has a variety of potential risks. We're looking at the expected annual loss data from riverine flooding, and it provides a county level assessment of vulnerabilities. And it looks at property and population and agriculture. The formula that it uses there is the expected annual loss times that social vulnerability divided by the community resilience. It's kind of the overall risk map that they have, and I'll show a map of Nebraska here in a second. But an expected annual loss then is a combination of the annual frequency or rate of occurrence, how likely is the hazard to occur, times the exposure, what is vulnerable to that risk, people, agriculture, property, times the historic loss ratio. And that's from information on losses incurred, both property, people, and crop losses that have occurred. So that all wraps into that first term on that risk. And they've got a project, and this is what they have currently for, it's a relative rating for the state of Nebraska, statewide for expected annual loss rating. So it's a qualitative assessment. As I said, this the narrative in the hazard mitigation plan document will be building and present this build upon this information, and the narrative will be expanded with the thought that the risk assessment that we're doing from the more detailed analysis using the flood hazard and the critical infrastructure and those things that meet the requirements of statute would be an appendix to the hazard mitigation plan document, just based upon the timing of our deliverable to the legislature, well, to the governor's office in June and the legislature by July. Adele, any other input or comments on that?
No, thanks, John, for covering it. we've got a couple timelines that we're working with, and yeah, thank you.
John, it looks like we have someone with their hand raised. Michelle, would you be able to unmute Tom Mountford?
Okay, am I coming through now?
Yep, we can hear
you. Good, John. Yeah, very good process here. A lot of us, of course, we have our district-wide hazard mitigation plans. We've worked with communities on the local level and district level, and NRDs have. But my question is, John, do we, through this, is it sort of identify different flood projects already in place, and along with it, depending on the flood that might occur, you have a lot of damage. There's more risk if those things fail, as we found out 2019. Is that addressed somehow, that identifies these projects and what good they're doing? Because there's a lot of state and federal partners involved with most of these. And I think we kind of address that in our local plans. Sometimes they need money from FEMA in some manner to repair those down the road, or strengthen them, that type of thing. I'm not sure how that would be mentioned, but just a question.
Yeah, so there's a couple things about that, Tom, and I think one of the things that we're compiling again, and I think this is your question. You have to tell me if I'm off base, but one of the things that we're looking at is areas protected by levees, and getting some valuation data on parcel and improvements behind a levee that would kind of bolster that case when you've got a or below a dam. We've got a lot of information that we've gotten from the state dam safety on areas protected, so you can get an idea of the value. Looking at a full economic evaluation at various flow rates is a little bit beyond the scope of this, but at least it provides an idea of the relative value of the mitigation action. Does that get to your question?
Yes. I don't know if I asked it quite but no, you addressed that very well. I just thought then there's some recognition of past efforts, what good they're doing, but along with it, there is some risk downstream should they fail. Of course, our high hazard dams were required to have emergency action plans should we have some problems, but through our hazard mitigation plan locally, we identified the breach zone from several of the non-high hazard dams, just as there was extra money available in the FEMA grant, and we thought that'd be a good thing to identify those areas and share that with the counties, emergency managers, and that. So anyway, it sounds like this is a broader view, but it sounds like that does give some value to that and recognition of what's out there.
Yeah, I think that's what our goal is, at least, to get an idea of what's protected, and then, as you said, the converse side to that is what's potentially vulnerable in the event of failure. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. The next topic we wanted to hit on was the mitigation strategies and the project pages. And if you recall, in October, we went through the mitigation actions and discussed those. They were available for comment, and we received comments on those, and Adele had walked through those in detail. And there were really 4 categories to align with what FEMA's mitigation action categories are. There was the structure and infrastructure elements. There was the natural system protection. There's education and awareness programs, and then local plans and regulations. And so we took the table that Adele had that had each one of these elements in the multiple amounts of specific mitigation actions under those, and we developed project pages that we are hoping serves as kind of an a la carte menu that provides information that's readily available for the local communities as they're developing their floodplain management program. And these project pages, they each contain a description and what it does, why it's important, where it's applicable, a stepwise kind of approach to implementation, some discussion on relative cost considerations, and then a link for additional information. And we've assembled these for, and let me see if I can open that. This is the document that we'll be posting for your input. There it is. I'll share this. This will be an appendix to the plan. You can see here are the specific mitigation strategies and the practices and the project sheets. I think there's 12 of them all together. You can see kind of a summary here that has by the different categories. Again, the 4 FEMA categories, and then we've put together a key and an applicability. So if you're a local floodplain administrator, you've got certain elements of your floodplain you're managing. Is it an undeveloped area? Is it in a developed area? What the relative cost is. Is it a low cost option, or are there more from operation and maintenance long-term requirements, as well as is it a nature-based solution? And so this is kind of a one-stop shop on the types of challenges you're facing or your situation in your floodplains, and it talks about the specific practices, and you'll see these icons show up when we get to each of the individual project pages. The different icons that represent low cost, low maintenance, undeveloped, developed, and this is what the templates look like. They're meant to be a concise resource that provides a lot of plain language that can be readily available. And so when you're reviewing these, please think of them in that standpoint. And if we're missing the mark, we'd love to hear. But I'm not going to go through every one of these, but you can kind of see each one's got kind of what's the intention, where is it applicable, why would you do it? It's got a detailed kind of stepwise for the implementation. It's got a qualitative cost considerations and benefits. And then on each one, there's typically a link to additional resource that can provide more information. Similar for building codes, stormwater management options. There's a couple examples in this case for resources that we've provided from EPA, as well as things like the City of Omaha and the City of Lincoln requirements. There's examples. Floodplain ordinances, again, kind of the how, the resources available from the department. There's a couple of these, I think we had some photos. You'll see the color coding matches each of those categories. So I think we're on to local plans, or maybe this is education and awareness. And then we get into the natural nature-based solutions. And this one actually has some of the photos and examples, and there's a lot of information and examples out there. So there's actually 2 pages. Enhancing floodplains, and then finally we get into some of the structural measures. Oh, this is a document that's going to be posted to the website. A notice will be sent to you, and we'd love to have you give these a read and let us know if they're missing some key pieces, or if they're still too technical, or how we can enhance these. Again, the thought is it'd be an a la carte menu of options that that would be readily available and can be acted upon at the local level.
John, we have a question that came up in our chat box. Lori Bestgen, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, Lori. She's asking, after the flood risk assessment is completed, are there plans to revisit the mitigation actions to ensure there are actions relevant to identified risk?
Yeah, I think there's a couple pieces to that. I think we have enough information to help inform the mitigation actions with the information that we do have. I think what's going to lag is really the development of the GIS tool part. But I think that would be an option that would be available. It will be incorporated as an appendix. Katie or Adele, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, another dimension to this is our overall plan update process, in which we reevaluate the language of our suggested mitigation actions, and we'll be, updating them with that plan update process. So there's adjustments that may be made, as our analysis is developed or refined, and then through the just general efforts to keep our document up to date with known concepts and resources.
Right. Okay. Let's see. Repetitive loss. And I think Adele was going to walk us through.
Thanks, John. Yeah, just a few slides here. One of the other review documents we'll have on the website, in addition to those mitigation action strategy sheets that John just walked you through, is our repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss strategy. And this will be an appendix in the plan. By having this strategy in the plan, we enable applicants or projects for flood mitigation assistance grants to access a higher level of federal cost share. Standard is 75%, but if it's a project that is mitigating a repetitive loss structure, then it's going to be eligible for up to 90% of federal cost share by virtue of this strategy being in the plan. So that means the community would be responsible for up to, or at least 10% of the project cost. With severe repetitive loss properties, then the federal cost share that they are eligible for becomes up to 100% of the project cost. So there's significant advantages to have this strategy within our plan. And again, it applies to flood mitigation assistance grants. Note that for flood mitigation assistance grants, the applicable repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss definitions are those that are found in 44 of the Title 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations in Section 77.2, items I and J. For the work that we do here in the floodplain management section, we also engage with additional definitions describing repetitive loss, and we have those noted in the plan document as well. They're for NFIP and CRS program administration. So we do want it known that we utilize repetitive loss building definition that's in the flood insurance manual. And then there's also definitions for repetitive loss community, property, severe repetitive loss property, all described in the CRS coordinator's manual. And that's aligned with the NFIP initiatives as well. Next slide, please. And then also included in this strategy document that will be available for review, we've got our table of 16 known flood mitigation assistance funded property acquisitions If you've got those in your jurisdiction, please verify that we've got that data correct. We did verify this list in early 2020, but it could be there are some omissions, so do check that and let us know. We also provide an overview of the results of the Nebraska Silver Jackets Repetitive Loss 2.0 study, and that's where the Silver Jackets team FEMA data regarding what repetitive loss structures and severe repetitive loss structures exist in the state versus our own hazard mitigation list. And they were able to identify 34 structures from that list that were reasonable to explore non-structural mitigation strategies for. That includes acquisition, elevation, wet flood proofing, and flood fronts. So they took those 34 structures and did their cost benefits analysis, and they were able to identify that 19 showed a positive BCR, that is a benefit cost ratio, and it's an indicator that shows the relationship between relative cost of a project and the benefits of that proposed project. So they found that if you mitigated these 19 with a positive BCR rating or BCR, then you'd have an anticipated project cost of about $2.7 million, but you would have a risk reduction benefit of $10.4 million over project life. It should be noted, project life is 30 years if it's elevation or flood fence, and it's 100 years if it's an acquisition project. Additionally, they found that 10 more structures fell below $175,000 in project costs, which is sort of for elevation. And this is a predetermined elevation cost that FEMA considers cost effective. So they too are potential candidates for flood mitigation assistance-based mediation. And then, of course, we've got some additional information about completed flood risk identification projects that DNR has been instrumental in. And then we've got a list of our ongoing flood risk identification projects. And then finally, we've got our repetitive loss mitigation strategy. And on this next slide, I've got it summarized. Essentially, we're going to continue to provide technical assistance to communities in terms of floodplain management, grant access, grant eligibility, mitigation strategies, and verify repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss property information. We're going to continue to promote CRS to communities across the state. It should be noted that in communities that have repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss, CRS does require an evaluation of those properties. So we will help with that. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program will continue to administer and promote that program and certainly prioritize these repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties for funding. And then always when it comes to our local hazard mitigation plans, we really want to ensure that the repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss structures are being considered for mitigation projects and included in those plan updates. And yeah, that summarizes the strategy. If you've got suggestions as to additional actions, just fill out the comment sheet that's available on our project website and submit that with your comments, noting they're pertinent to the repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss strategy document, and we'll take those into consideration. And yeah, with that, unless there's any questions on this section, we can move on to our next step slide.
Okay. Thank you, Adele. So as we conclude here on the ongoing efforts, as we talked about, we're continuing to work on the risk assessment. and we're in the final throes of pulling together the draft plan document, and incorporating all the comments on the sections we've received from you, and compiling into a single draft plan document. Again, targeting March to get that to you for our discussion in April. The plan documents that are available for review or will be shortly, and a notice will be sent. Again, the link to where everything is will be included, as well as there'll be the document as well as the review comment form. And the two sections are those project pages that I showed, as well as the repetitive loss strategy document that Adele just mentioned. From an upcoming document review, we'll have the compilation of the draft plan document that will be available prior to our next meeting in April. And our risk assessment portion will likely be following our meeting in April. So next steps, I did, for those of you, before you leave, we're running, I guess we got about 7 minutes. We're looking at our next round of public meetings in late April, in which we'll have the draft plan document. It will be around the state. In June, when we kicked this off, we went to Lincoln and Kearney and Alliance and Valentine and Norfolk. We're looking at determining and doing the planning for our next round in late April. We'd like your input. There's a mentee survey that is at that link, www.menti.com. It'll ask you for a code, and the code to this survey is 42285534. And there's a list, I think there's maybe 15 locations throughout the state of Nebraska. We're asking you to pick 3 to help us determine where we're going to go. We need to have statewide coverage. We will have a meeting and a public hearing in Lincoln for sure to allow access to senators. But we would like your input on that. And that code should be active right now. So whenever you get a chance, please visit. Julie, any other items on the survey?
Nope, I put a link to the menti.com in the chat, and the code's there too. So we're already starting to get some responses in our survey. They're trickling in. It's a long list to read through first, but
yeah. Okay, great. So our next steps are then to complete the risk assessment and compile the draft plan document. And then our next meeting is April 12th at 10 a.m. And the focus of that meeting will be to walk through the draft plan document. Hopefully you'll have a chance to read it and come with comments, and we can review that portion together with the goal that we would have incorporate any edits and changes as required, that we would then go to our public meetings with in late April. Review of our meeting topics. Our draft plan review is our next meeting number 6. And then our final meeting will be following our public hearing and public meetings, feedback and a recap on that, a final draft plan document, and approval from the stakeholder group. That's all the information we had today. If you have any thoughts or comments on the survey or any of the takeaways, certainly the repetitive loss and the project pages will be getting out to you from a document stand format for you to review as well. there's any questions or thoughts, it would be, we got a few minutes left. Let me take down my, let me stop sharing so I can see the chat box. Okay. Adele or Katie, any closing thoughts? I see a question. Will there be emails for the next meetings? Yes, there will be. There will be emails sent out when the documents are posted, both the repetitive loss and the project pages, as well as the draft document. And we'll be sending out an email notification for the April 12th meeting.
Yeah, and thanks, Joe Chandler. I was able to find that memorandum from September 29th announcing those new rates. So I'll make a quick revision to our risk strategy and then upload that. So thanks.
For those of you that haven't participated in the Menti poll yet, I will leave it open for a few minutes following the meeting, so you'll get a chance to get in there and provide any feedback you want to give. But it will eventually close this morning, and so make sure if you want to have some feedback on where we should hold or where you'd like to see public meetings held for the plan, make sure you get in there sooner rather than later.
All right. Well, again, thank you all for attending. And with that, I think we'll call the meeting to a close. Thank you.